Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 long board games. These are board games that are an investment of your time, and I find all 10 of these games to be very enjoyable games. But I must admit, the bottom half of this list are games that while I enjoy, while I appreciate, while I recognize their value in game design, I also feel their length. While the top 5 games are a little bit better at getting me immersed and involved enough to forget that time is passing. However, the top 5 games are also long games as well. So without any further ado, let's get straight to my list. My number 10 long board game is Aura and Labora by Uwe Rosenberg. And this is one of Uwe Rosenberg's worker placement, kind of agricultural, medieval themed games that he's kind of known for nowadays. He has tons of games that kind of recreate this trope or revisit this theme here and this mechanism. But Aura and Labora, I find to be an amazing game. First of all, we have this wheel that determines the value of all of the different resources. And as the game progresses and players are spending goods or producing goods, and as the rounds are advancing, not only does this wheel here keep track of the game round and basically determine when the game ends, but it also determines the particular value of each resource and how much of said resource each player can produce if they choose to do so at that given time. I find this to be a really cool thing to manipulate, to maneuver through. It also serves as a reminder of which player gets one more action than the other, because when you're playing with more than one player, when you're playing multiplayer, certain players get an additional action on each given round. So one player might be able to take 2 actions while another player might only take 1. Now, this is one of those games that's fixed as far as game end is concerned. You play a specific number of rounds, and the rulebook comes with both a short and a longer, fuller version of the game. And even the shorter version of the game is still pretty long. It's pushing the 2-hour mark. If you play the longer version of the game, then you're talking about a 3-hour game that for this style of game feels very repetitive. I love the mechanisms. As I mentioned, you have the wheel that you use to determine the value of each of the different resources. It also includes worker placement with a really cool prior worker, because you're kind of recreating medieval monastic life here, and your prior is one of your monks, your monk workers, that has a special ability, because when you play him, you're able to trigger the ability of a building that had just been built right then and there. Otherwise, you would have to wait till a future turn to trigger a building that has just been built if your prior worker is not available, and your prior is only one of 3 possible workers that you have in your pool. You have the resource conversion that Lahav is known and loved for here as well. Tons of resources to manage, tons of decisions where you can convert one resource into another one to your convenience. You also have this spatial element where you start with your main board, which has your monastery, and it has a lot of farmland and coastland and all that stuff for you to build additional things, and you expand to the left, to the right, upward, and downward to make this bigger board that can accommodate more buildings, because just like in Lahav, you are investing in these different buildings that will produce different types of resources for you, convert different resources for you, and accrue points for you in different ways. Even the placement of your buildings is very crucial, because they score victory points at the end of the game according to where you place them. Lots of cool and neat, fascinating elements of this game from a mechanical perspective, but I must admit that every time I play, I kind of feel the burden of the time investment. Even the setup and the takedown is a time investment in and of itself. And then again, the time that you just spend sitting down there playing the game, very enjoyable, but still feels a little bit long. My number 10 long game of all time, Aura and Labora. Now we move on to my number 9. My number 9 long game is Shogun, designed by Durkan and published by Queen Games. This is a medieval, feudal Japanese themed game where players are vying for control of different regions in Japan, and each player is controlling a historical samurai, a historical Japanese leader from medieval times, And there's a lot of area control taking place in this game, lots of conflict, if you will. And the cool thing about it is how the conflict is resolved, which is through the placement of cubes in this little cube tower. And the cubes are color coordinated according to the player color, and some of them get stuck there in the creases of the dice tower, or the cube tower I should say, and as the game progresses they kind of get knocked loose and they come out. So you don't know what's going to happen just because you throw more cubes of your color inside of that cube tower than your opponent does not ensure that you will have the victory in that particular conflict. However, the leftover ones, the ones that remain in the cube tower, can come back to help you or assist you in the future, and that's kind of like a little bit of a memory game. Now it's really cool because there's a program action selection that takes place at the beginning of each round, and the game only consists of 4 rounds representing 4 different years, and these are very long rounds, folks. This program action selection at the beginning of the game, where you choose potentially up to 10 actions using your different territory cards, and you start with a certain amount of territory cards early on in the game, and as the game progresses, hopefully you're expanding your influence and your kingdom and your reach, and you're having more of these territory cards that you can use for your program action selection, because each action that you could take needs to have a corresponding action card or territory card. And some of the actions consist of recruiting or reinforcing your strength, your units in a particular section represented by the cubes. You can also go into another person's territory and attack them. Another thing you can do is you can tax these different regions for rice and for money, which are both valuable resources. However, you got to be careful and not go too all out or too crazy with the taxing, because what happens is the farmers in the territories that you tax end up getting upset with you, and this creates potential revolts in future turns. So you don't want to tax any given region more than once, because once you do, it increases the level of dissatisfaction with those farmers, and again, it makes it harder for you in the future, and you will pay the consequences for messing with those farmers. Really fun, really enjoyable game, but again, one of those games that I feel its length. It takes a long time to get ready to play it, to tear the game down, and again, just the process of the program action selection and then carrying out all of those actions. Very long turns, long game, but a good one. My number 9 long game, Shogun. Now we move on to my number 8, and my number 8 long game is Lahav, designed by Uwe Rosenberg. And the reason why this game is ranked number 8 is not because I like all of the 7 games above it more. This definitely would outdo some of these games as far as my placement for favorites. However, Lahav comes with 2 versions, a short version and a long version, just like Aura and Labora does. But unlike Aura and Labora, the short version feels pretty adequate. The short version, if you're playing 2 players, like I mostly play this game, is about 45 minutes, and it feels good. It feels nice. It feels like it hits the mark. However, the long version is a long game. It does push the game to about an hour and a half for 2 players, pushing the 2 and 2 hour plus mark if you're playing with 3, 4, or 5 players, as the game allows for. The thing is that I'm not a big fan of the longer game. Not because it's longer necessarily, because it's not too much longer at a 2-player count, but because it has this very slow start. So basically the way that they adjust for the shorter version of the game is by allowing the players to start with more resources. If you play the longer version of the game, they kind of have this arbitrary way of extending the game by starting with a meager or limited amount of resources. And I feel that the shorter version of the game actually falls in line with the spirit, the generous spirit of Lahav. Lahav, unlike many of Uwe Rosenberg's other games like Bonanza and Agricola, these games are very restrictive and stingy, and I actually appreciate it in those games. But Lahav is a generous game. You produce lots of resources and lots of money throughout the course of the game, so it just makes sense to start off with a good supply of resources right off the bat. So therefore, I do prefer the shorter version of the game. The long version of the game is okay. I don't mind playing it maybe once in a while, but for the most part, I will be playing Lahav, the shorter version of the game, and enjoying it that way. Worker placement, resource conversion, as I mentioned, fun city building game. My number 8 longer game, Lahav. And my number 7 longer board game is War of the Ring. And War of the Ring here is based on J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings Middle-earth universe. And this game encompasses the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, how does a board game accomplish this? by making the game very, very long. This game, very thematic, very immersive, but it takes quite a while to play it. This is a two-player or two-sided game where one player takes on the force, the side of the Fellowship, led by Samwise Gamgee and Frodo, and the other player takes on the forces of the Shadow or the forces of Sauron. And this game is asymmetric to its core, from the end game winning condition where the forces of Sauron are trying to conquer a certain amount of territories, while the Fellowship player is trying to secretly, covertly progress towards Mordor, to Mount Doom, in order to destroy the One Ring. And it's a really cool hidden movement mechanism that takes place as far as how the Fellowship progresses in this game. This game is very asymmetric in every sense. The amount of dice that players roll on their turn, depending on which side they're playing, is different. The amount of actions they can take are different, and the types of actions quite often are very different as well. Again, as I mentioned, this game is very thematic, very immersive. I would say that for the first half of the game or so, you kind of don't realize that time is passing. But towards the latter end of the game, you do realize that you are investing lots of time in this game. You probably want to set aside a block of time for this game. This game is going to take at minimum 2 hours, probably even as much as 4 hours, depending on how things go. And you probably don't have the time to do that on a weeknight. This game is probably better reserved for a weekend experience, or probably just an event in and of itself. Fun game. You do feel its length. Longer commitment to play. My number 7 longer board game, War of the Rings 2nd edition. And now we move on to my number 6. And my number 6 longer board game is A Game of Thrones, the board game. And this game here, designed by Christian Peterson and published by Fantasy Flight Games here in its 2nd edition, based on the very popular novel and TV series from George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. And basically, this game here, you have a map which consists of the land of Westeros, and each player takes on one of the respective houses of Westeros. And there's 6 houses in the base game, and 2 additional houses if you purchase one of the expansions. As a matter of fact, there's a couple other out-of-print expansions that also include additional houses. And basically, each player is fighting for control of the Iron Throne. And the endgame condition is to either go through 10 very long rounds, or be the first player to control up to 7 different strongholds and or castles. And all of that takes a while. There's lots of politics going on, alliances, betrayals, lots of attacking. This is a attack-heavy game, lots of defending, providing support for allies or neighbors around you, lots of intrigue with this card play mechanism that takes place during each combat session. You really got to be very crafty and thoughtful and strategic as far as choosing the cards you play when and where, because then you will have to discard those cards and they won't be available for you for the near future. Really cool game, brings you into that Game of Thrones feeling and spirit, and if you play this with the right group, namely a group of people that either enjoy the intellectual property of Game of Thrones or do not mind longer, more immersive gaming experiences, then this game can be a very positive and enjoyable time. However, I must say, this game, you do feel its length. While War of the Ring can, on the extreme end, last 4 hours, A Game of Thrones, regularly speaking, is going to last you at least 4 hours. The back of the box says 2 to 4 hours. I do not know how you can possibly play this in 2 hours unless you make some house rules and adjust maybe the end game conditions. I don't see possibly how you can play this in 2 hours. The shortest I've been able to play this at 4 hours. The longest I played this for was 6 hours, and we had to call the game early. A lot of it was that was the first time we played. It was a teaching game, so there was that. But even so, even trying to go at a rapid clip, this game is going to be quite the time investment, and you do feel its time. It's the type of game that you probably don't want to play more than once or twice a year. My number 6 longer board game, A Game of Thrones, the board game. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. And as I mentioned earlier, these are games that, while some of them may not be as long as the games on the bottom half of the list, a lot of them are long or equally as long as the bottom half of the list, but you don't feel it as much, or at least I personally do not feel their length as much when I get into these games. My number 5 long board game is Arkham Horror 2nd Edition. And this is my representation for the Cthulhu Mythos Lovecraftian themed games from Fantasy Flight Games. Arkham Horror can be a very long game. It's the longest of all the Lovecraft games I've played. You're looking at 2 to 4 hours of gameplay, depending on the player count, and this game is a cooperative game that can go all the way up to 8 players. I've never played 8 players, and I've never played more than 4, so I don't think I'll ever get to those outer ends. But even playing this game solo and going at a very rapid clip, I played a game not too long ago that lasted about an hour and 40 minutes, and I was very satisfied with that. But that's still quite an investment for what would be a quick game in this gaming experience here of Arkham Horror. This game is very thematic. It's very immersive. This is the type of game that you just want to kind of lay back. It does have some cool, neat, interesting mechanisms as far as combat is concerned, as far as skill checks and what have you. Movement that takes place on the board, which is an abstracted map of Arkham, Massachusetts. And basically, you really want to just kind of sit back, enjoy the flavor text, enjoy the lore, enjoy the narrative that's being written as you play when you read all of these different encounter cards that you're going to engage with. That's part of the joy of the game, really, to get yourself immersed in the theme. And because it's such an immersive experience, thematically speaking, it's almost like a role-playing game type of experience. Because of that, the time seems to go by quicker than some of the games on the bottom part of the list. Some of the mechanisms you might feel are a little bit outdated, and games like Eldritch Horror may have modified and improved upon the gaming system. However, Arkham Horror is still, while an acquired taste, an enjoyable alternative for me to Eldritch Horror when I have the time to play a longer, more immersive Cthulhu experience. This is where I go to. And because it is the longer game, it's the one I included for this particular list. My number 5 long board game, Arkham Horror 2nd Edition. Now we move on to my number 4. And my number 4 is Thunderstone Quest. And Thunderstone Quest here is a fantasy-themed deck building dungeon crawl style game where players are exploring a dungeon, delving deep into it, fighting different monsters at different levels, gaining experience points, and catching in those experience points in order to level up their characters. Their characters, however, are represented by their deck of cards, which start with level 0 adventurers who ultimately you will upgrade into clerics and fighters and rogues and wizards of level 1, 2, and all the way up to 3. And as you level up your characters, you're basically burning or destroying and eliminating the lower level characters. So your deck always stays at a very manageable size, and you get to cull your deck of lots of these weaker, insignificant cards, which I always enjoy when deck building games allow for that. Very fun and thematic from that perspective. Now, what makes this qualify for this list, this game here, the back of the box says it's 60 to 90 minutes. And while 60 to 90 minutes at face value might not seem like a longer game, this is on the outer end, on the longer end of the spectrum as far as deck builders are concerned. I prefer my deck builders to be quick, 30, 45 minutes. Once a deck builder is pushing an hour, I'm usually not interested. And this game goes all the way up to 1 hour and a half sometimes, maybe even a little bit more depending on how many players you're playing with and what pace you're going, right? Because this game has a very open-ended gaming condition where if players are a little bit more on the conservative side, the game might last a little bit longer. If players are a little bit more aggressive attacking the monsters, that can speed up the game. So it's all about the group and the kind of players you're playing with. But while deck building is the main mechanism of this game, the dungeon crawl, dungeon delve aspect, as well as the exploration of the village for different possible upgrades, it keeps you a little bit more engaged, a little bit more immersed than some of these other long deck builders where all you're doing is drafting cards, shuffling decks, and drawing new hands. That repetitive process becomes redundant in a longer deck builder. And I find that Thunderstone Quest satisfies that, again, with that combat element of delving into the dungeon and exploring it and going as deep as you can. Really cool, really enjoyable, longer end of the deck building games, but still a fun and satisfying experience. My number 4 long board game, Thunderstone Quest. My number 3 long board game is Kiklaties, designed by Ludovic Mablanc and Bruno Cathala. And this is a Greek theme area control civilization game where each player is controlling a different faction or a different group from the Kiklaties Islands, trying to control all of these different islands on the board through some combat that takes place and is resolved through the rolling of a die. The interesting thing about this game is the actions that take place. The actions all correspond to some of the different gods from the Greek pantheon that players are vying for or auctioning and bidding for at the beginning of each round. And not only does the bid determine which god favors which particular player, and basically which player controls the benefits of that particular god, but the auction is also for turn order because the Greek gods are lined up randomly each round in a different order. So sometimes you might want Zeus's power, but at the same time you really want Ares because Ares is earlier on in the turn order, so you're willing to pass up Zeus for the time being. Really cool. I love it when games incorporate that auction bidding for turn order that takes place here. And this has an Amon-Ra style of auctioning where when you bid, you place your piece that represents your bid on a particular number ranging from 0 to 10. And if a player outbids you, you immediately remove that auction piece from the god you were bidding for. And right then and there, you make a new auction, a new bid for a different god. And basically, you have the opportunity to push someone else out of their current bid as well. So there's a lot of going back and forth with players outdoing each other in the bidding. So I really like that open-ended kind of less monotonous, less rigid type of auctioning that takes place in this game. It's a more creative way partaking in the auction bidding mechanism. Really cool. I like the theme. This game here, sometimes the back of the box, I don't see it here, but this game here, it usually takes us about an hour and a half or even more to play when we're playing at 4 or 5 players. And even so, by the time the game ends, I check my watch, I check the phone, and I realize that lots of time passed, but I didn't notice. I didn't feel it while the game was being played. While the game was being played, I was so immersed and I was enjoying the experience so much that it's as if time had not gone by. My number 3 longer game, Kiklaties. And now we move on to my number 2 long board game, and that is Power Grid, designed by Freedom and Fries. And this game here is basically a game where players are running their own power companies, and the board consists of a map of different regions. The base game comes with North America on one side, Germany on the other. There's tons of expansion maps that take you to Europe and to the Middle East and to Asia and all these different continents and countries. And there's some route network building because you're trying to establish your network of cities that you're going to supply power to. And it's interesting because you have to pay a base of amount in order to put your little houses to represent your presence in that city. But in order to connect one city to another, you also need to pay the connection price that you'll find on a route in between those two cities. And early on in the game, each city can only accommodate 1 player. But as the game progresses, you'll have a second spot allotted and a third spot allotted. But it still feels tight throughout the game, especially if you're playing at the higher player counts. And speaking of player counts, this game here can last a very long time if you play to its full complement of 5 players. I've never played this game more than 3. I've played 3 a few times. I actually mostly play it 2 because it comes with a pretty decent and solid 2-player variant. Not to mention, I do own the Robot expansion, which basically introduces a third artificial intelligence opponent that's not capable of winning the game, but definitely throws a monkey wrench into your best laid plans and makes the players factor in the possibility of more than one person messing with them. Even so, at a 2-player or 3-player count, this game is going to take about an hour and a half, maybe even closer to 2 hours, which for a Euro economic simulation, resource management type game, does feel on the longer end. Lots of these Euro games are best when kept between 45 minutes to maybe 75 minutes. I feel like that's kind of like the sweet spot for these middle to heavyweight Euros. But Power Grid is pushing that 2-hour mark. I would imagine that if you're playing 4 or 5 players, it's definitely going to pass that 2-hour mark, maybe even encroach on the 3-hour mark, which sounds intense. And I'm not going to say what I would feel like if I was playing a 4 or 5 player game. Probably the wait time in between my turns would make me feel the length of the game a little bit more. But at 2 or 3 players, I am immersed, I'm enjoying it, and the fact that the endgame trigger is so open-ended, it's not a particular amount of rounds, although you do have an idea of as to how many rounds this game could last, but it's on a particular amount of cities. So depending on the pace of the players and what have you, you can kind of determine that the game will end a little bit quicker. Really enjoyable, really satisfying, longer game, but I don't feel it. My number 2 long game, Power Grid. And now we move on to the number 1, my number 1 longer board game, and that is Robinson Crusoe, designed by Ignacy Trzewiczek and published by Portal Games. And this here is the cooperative, brutal, difficult game of survival where players are stranded on an island, the Cursed Island. And this game accommodates anywhere from 1 to 4 players. You can play it solo. You can play as far as 4 players. And players are collaborating in order to survive basically the elements in the island and also accomplish the winning condition for the particular scenario. The base game here comes with 7 scenarios. I've only played the first 2 and they are quite challenging enough as it is. This game will beat you up and have you struggling for survival, which is one of the reasons why it feels shorter than what it actually plays. This game here, the back of the box says it plays anywhere from 60 to 120 minutes. I'm not sure if I've ever played this at 60 minutes or under 60 minutes, and I'm pretty sure that if I have, those were not really good games. Those are probably games where the game beat me up even more than usual. Definitely, if you're going to win this game, it's going to be quite an investment. The rounds, you're talking about 10, 12 rounds, depending on the scenario. And it takes a while because you have all these different phases that you have to go through for each of the rounds. And there's a lot of reading going on. You have event cards that you're reading at the beginning of each of your rounds. You have different encounters that you partake in depending on the different actions you take and whether or not you draw certain cards from particular decks. So there's a lot of that, but there's also a lot of meaty, crunchy decisions taking place. You're trying to map out your turns as much as possible because this is a worker placement game where you are going to do your action phase, and before you actually execute your actions, you kind of have to decide all your actions, and then you're going to carry them out in a particular order. So that makes you factor into what you decide to do on each given turn. There's a lot of opportunities for groupthink if you're playing multiplayer, but even if you're playing solo, there's just a lot of brainstorming or individual thinking that takes place in this game that makes it last a little bit longer, but you're so immersed and so concentrated and so focused at the task at hand that you don't even realize that time is really passing by. I've never played this game and felt that I regretted the time lost, and quite often it does appear to be time lost because I am on the losing side of the struggle here. But really enjoyable, really thematic. My number 1 longer board game, Robinson Crusoe. And that's it for today's video, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here when Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what's your favorite longer game to play. Tell me what you think about my list. Perhaps you don't consider these games to be longer at all. Perhaps you are disappointed that there are some omissions to this list. Hey, maybe you don't even like longer games to begin with. If you don't, I get you. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.